population dynamics can be confusing, as they are just that, dynamic, and many tools are used to describe and measure these dynamic populations. When looking at populations, you are looking at a whole slew of ideas and information. These can range from the interactions within and between different populations. The most common interactions within most species is competition. In the wild, resources are always limited, therefore competition is bound to occur. Take rabbits, for example. In small fields where grass can be limited, rabbits must compete with each other in order to get the energy required to survive. This will lead to high interspecific competition. Interspecific means that animals or individuals are fighting within a specific group or species, hence the name intra. Another big interaction that may be observed is predation. This occurs when one species survives off killing another species. An easy example we can view is the interactions between snakes and rabbits. The two lines you want to focus on are the purple and green lines on this graph. The purple represents our snake population, and the green represents our rabbit population, and the dark green represents our grass. Now, as you may notice, the snakes start off at a very small population of 13, while the rabbits start off at 226. Within months, the rabbit population experiences exponential growth due to the surplus of grass and a lack of predators. However, the snakes soon follow suit shortly after the rabbit's growth. This is due to an increase in the snake's food resource. Because there's an exponential growth with the rabbits, the snakes themselves are able to experience that exponential growth, just like how, because there was exponential growth for the grass, because there's few rabbits that were eating it, the rabbits were able to start eating more and having more kids. The same concept changed the snake, as there's more rabbits for the snakes to eat, therefore they could have more children as well. However, the grass soon starts to dip after the rabbit population grows too large for the grass to sustainably feed it. Then, rabbits start dying off quicker due to both a lack of food and high predator counts. This decrease results in a decline for the snake's food source as well. Eventually, the three populations, after fluctuating, reach a standstill where they won't decline or rise significantly. This is called the carrying capacity. The carrying capacity is the limit at which a species can live sustainably within an ecosystem. Defense mechanisms are another important factor that will occur within interspecific competition more often or not. Now, interspecific is the opposite of intraspecific, so it means that there's competition or some sort of interaction between two different species, not within a species. Now, butterflies use camouflage to avoid predators such as the monarch and the viceroy. The monarch is considered unpalatable to predators, and the viceroy is also toxic but more tolerable, according to the source. This type of camouflage is called mimicry. It's where one animal changes its look via gene manipulation to give the appearance of another species, often one that is considered undesirable by predators. This causes the predator to just avoid the species outright out of fear of biting into the wrong dish. Now, with this one, they mimic each other, so that way they create just a higher risk versus reward. So, if a predator is about to eat it, they can either risk biting into something that's not delicious at all, or risk biting into something that's slightly toxic. Either way, it's kind of a bad situation, therefore they just won't bother with attacking either one. Now, let's look at the common growth patterns observed amongst all species. These are exponential, sigmoid, and sinusoidal growth. Exponential growth is rarely seen in nature due to its requirements. Exponential growth requires infinite amounts of resources to continually grow without ever slowing down. However, the Earth does not have infinite resources. But these conditions can be simulated within labs, where scientists can influence the resources that a species may receive. The most common species observed within these conditions tend to be bacteria. Sigmoid growth, or logistic growth as it's sometimes called, considers the idea of carrying capacities which are necessary when looking at populations within the wild where any number of resources may be limited. Sigmoid growth was observed within our demonstrations with the rabbits earlier. As you saw, their growth grew exponentially. However, once resources were strained, they declined, with eventually all different organisms within that ecosystem leveling out, giving us the carrying capacity for each species that lived within that ecosystem. Sinusoidal growth tends to occur in more complicated ecosystems where more species must be taken into consideration. In the end, you will end up with a logistic-looking graph. However, instead of leveling out just under the carrying capacity or upon it, it will create a wave that tends to oscillate around the approximate line of carrying capacity, hence the name sinusoidal growth. Now, when comparing species, there are two groups that either may fall in. One of these groups is the K-selected species, which lives close to its carrying capacity, resulting in the sigmoidal growth pattern. The second category, R-selected species, choose a different approach. They tend to live close to their biotic potential, meaning they reproduce as much as they possibly can with as many offspring as they can. Their populations will often fluctuate around their carrying capacity, resulting in a sinusoidal growth pattern. Now, whether a species is considered a K-selected or R-selected species depends on a few factors: their survivorship curve and their fecundity. The fecundity I've already covered a bit. This involves the amount that they reproduce in a single lifespan and the amount of offspring they produce in a single reproductive cycle. The survivorship curves are ways of generalizing a population growth over time. As you see on the graph here, a type 1 species often experiences very little death early on in life, going on to live long lives, often suffering a rapid decline later in life. Humans would be a great example because we provide lots of care for our young, resulting in low death rates at a young age, and we often live long lives before natural causes get the better of us. Other species that may exhibit this behavior consist of large mammals, such as elephants, and other species that may exhibit this behavior can consist of large mammals, such as elephants. Type 2 species show a constant threat of death throughout their entire life, which results in a rather linear type curve. These patterns can often be viewed within birds or some types of lizards. Type 3 species often suffer many deaths early on in life, with a few members of a species that survive often living to a high age based on the species. One good example of a type 3 species would be oysters. They produce large amounts of offspring. However, many tend to die from predation or other causes before they can reach maturity. However, once they reach maturity, most tend to survive and produce offspring of their own. Here are some other important things that one should know about the study of population dynamics. There are two different ways to calculate growth within a species. These depend on whether or not the species live in a limitless environment or a limited environment. In both, however, you need the per capita growth rate. This is a topic I've not yet talked about, so let's hop in. The per capita growth rate, or abbreviated as CGR, is equal to the max population increase every year. Max meaning the growth rate under ideal conditions. This is calculated by finding the change in time of your population that you are studying, then dividing it by your original population. So, for example, if I started out with 200 rabbits, then 1 year later I had 220 rabbits. I would subtract my 200 rabbits from my 220, then divide it by 200, my original rabbit population. This will give me the per capita growth rate, or at least a rough estimate. It's from this value that we can create our two equations, one for exponential growth and one for logistic growth. The equation for exponential growth is simple. All you do is multiply your CGR by your total population, then add this new value onto your population. Then you take this new population, plug it back into the equation, and multiply it by the same CGR. And then add that value onto your population, and so on. And so eventually your population will just continuously increase, and each time it'll start increasing by more and more, creating your exponential curve. Now, for logistic growth, though, we have this extra piece of the equation. The K value is equal to your max carrying capacity. So you just subtract your population from your carrying capacity, divide it by your carrying capacity, and then multiply that whole part of the equation by the value that you would have got if you had just done the exponential growth equation. This value then gets added onto your population value, and you repeat so on, replacing your n values with the new population values every time. Eventually, that K variable will actually decrease the amount that your population increases to the point where once it hits that carrying capacity, it will no longer increase anymore, no matter how many times you multiply it or add it. Now, remember that this carrying capacity equation is always associated with logistic growth in a resource-limited ecosystem, while the other one without carrying capacity in the equation is for a limitless resource ecosystem. One final idea that is important in relation to the population dynamics is the minimum viable population size. This is the smallest population size that any one species may have without risking extinction within the next 100 years, or 40 generations. Finally, let's take all this information and use it to examine a particular species. Now, for the species that I want to examine, I will use Bengal tigers. Bengal tigers are typically perceived as a type 1 survivorship curve species, as they rely heavily on their parents for protection and food. This often results in them living full lifespans and therefore do not die until later in life, around 8 to 10 years of age. Their fecundity can be considered low, as they tend to have 2 to 3 cubs per reproductive cycle, and often give birth to a new litter every 2.5 years. And they reach sexual maturity at around 3 to 4 years of age in females. So this averages at around 2 litters per life. And as I mentioned above, they tend to take care of their young very well, averaging about to 1/3 of their lifespan, or 3 years. Tigers in general do not have many predators, with their biggest threat being humans or other large animals such as buffalo, elephants, and bears. Bengal tigers are estimated at being a little more than 2,500 individuals total, and are considered the most numerous of all tiger subspecies. The minimum viable population size of a Bengal tiger is placed at around 2,377. In 2010, there was an estimated max of 1,909 individuals, and by 2014, that increased to an estimated 2,226 individuals. Using this data, we can estimate a max growth rate in the same conditions experienced within the 4-year growth period of about 0.17. Now, because we do not have any rough estimate for carrying capacity, we can't really do much with this growth rate equation. However, if we really wanted to, we could potentially go in and try and find ourselves a carrying capacity by looking at the growth rate of previous years and seeing how much it grew by. And if it didn't grow by much, then we could estimate a carrying capacity of around 2,500 individuals. But I do not have time for that, so we're just going to move on. Now, for the final thing I'd like to discuss, tigers are considered K-selected species as they invest a lot of time into their young and produce few offspring, meaning that they also tend to live close to their carrying capacity. Therefore, we could assume that their carrying capacity could be around 2,500. So, that's about it for population dynamics, and I hope you enjoyed this project as much as I enjoyed making it. Thank you.